Hi, everyone. I'm Asya Pereltsvaig. I'm a linguist and an educator, and I'm an author of this book published by Cambridge University Press called Languages of the World, an Introduction. I have in my hand the second edition. This, if you want to take a look, is the first edition that came out in 2012. This edition came out in 2017, and the third edition is being printed as we speak. It's coming out in October, early November, and you can pre-order on Amazon or directly from Cambridge University Press. And you can also get instructors' exam copies if you're interested in examining the book. So I'm going to talk today about the book and some of its features that are useful for teaching remotely. And I'm also going to answer your questions. And if you have questions, you can type them and I will later receive them and I will try to address all of them. And also, if you guys have tips or advice on teaching online, because everyone's had different experiences, I would very much welcome you to write those in the comment question section as well, if you just want to share some advice or suggestions or tips for other instructors so we can all learn from each other. I've taught a class called Languages of the World, primarily at Stanford University, but also in different settings from high school to adult education, so ages 15 to 85 and anything in between. And I also taught this class as an online class through Stanford Continuing Education program. I taught it about 5 years ago on Zoom, before it was fashionable to teach on Zoom, before we all had to teach it through Zoom and other similar platforms. So I taught a class online by design where, we all knew in advance that the class is going to go online. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this book, and I'm also going to tell you about my own experience in teaching online so that hopefully some of these tips are going to be helpful to you. So the book, as it says, is an introduction to the world of languages and languages of the world. It's structured primarily geographically. So each chapter talks about languages in a particular region, in a particular part of the world. The third edition will actually include a map in the beginning that shows the breakdown. So if you want to focus on a particular part of the world, you can see more easily which chapter to look at. So it's structured geographically. Each chapter sort of gives an introduction to the range of languages spoken in that particular part of the world, the language families, a little bit about their history, a little bit about their characteristic typological features, what are some of the interesting sounds that those languages have, or grammatical features, or some sociolinguistic properties. So it covers a range of different linguistic areas as it relates to languages of a particular region. Each chapter also has a section called Focus On section at the end of the chapter, where we talk about some particular topic, like it could be pigeons, it can be politeness in languages, it can be parametric theory or language variation. So it's a variety of different topics. And at the end of each chapter, you'll also find some problems or topics for discussion, some homeworks, if you will, that relate to languages in that particular part of the world. In the second edition, each chapter contains 5 different problems. In the third edition that's coming out this fall, there's almost twice as many problems over the different chapters. So I've really increased that feature. Another feature that I've been developing in this book since the first edition, and sort of there's more of it in the second and even more in the third, is breaking the book into smaller sections, smaller sort of text boxes. There's a lot of different types of text boxes. There are specific sections in each chapter that are highlighted, and it says advanced. So you can assign those readings if you teach it in a more advanced class where students have a little more background in linguistics. But the non-advanced parts, sort of the main parts of the book, can be taught to students who have no background in linguistics. I taught it to people in adult education who have zero background in linguistics, have never taken another linguistics class, and quite possibly will never take an advanced or any other linguistic class. So the book is really meant to be an introduction. It also contains, at the end of the book, a glossary of terms, and whenever a new term, a linguistic term like phoneme or subject or case, whenever it's first mentioned in the book, it's highlighted, and students can refer to the glossary to read the definition, even if the definition is usually also in and around that first mention somewhere in the text. But if they later find the term and they can't remember what case systems are, they can look it up in the glossary sort of conveniently at the end of the book. At the end of the book, you'll also find a glossary of terms, an index of terms, and also an index of languages. And I counted in the third edition, there's over 800 languages in the index, meaning over 800 languages are at least mentioned, if not discussed in great detail, of course, because it's only like a limited size of the book, but there's a lot of languages that are mentioned. So there's a lot of information for students. And as I mentioned before, it's broken down into smaller pieces. What I had in mind is sort of the 21st century student who is with this hyperlink mentality, like just little bits of text, but having a lot of interrelations between different parts of the text, kind of like clicking on links when you read something online. Another thing that I had in mind when I was working on this book in the first and second and third edition, more and more so, is making this book interesting and useful vis-a-vis what's available online. And I think now that we're teaching online and we make even more focus on using online resources, I've been really trying to make this book kind of complementary to the resources that are online. And in the book, you'll find some of the homeworks make direct reference to online resources. So it's very useful, particularly now with the remote instructions, in the sense that you can give those assignments to students as sort of a guided research online, because there's obviously a lot of things online and a lot of stuff about language is written not by linguists, but by self-proclaimed experts who don't really know much. But one of the tasks that I set for myself in teaching this class and in writing this book is teaching the students how to tell what's a good resource and what's not, and also how, introduce them gently to the good resources, to things like the Walsh database, Foible is the phonetics database, and other such research resources that are available online. In the third edition, let me tell you about some new features that will appear in the third edition. As I already mentioned, I added more assignments, problem sets, and will make answers available to instructors only, so that students cannot cheat, obviously. So you can still use them for gradable homeworks or even exams if you want to. I've also added a new type of text box, if you will, a sidebar. In each chapter, there's a sidebar called Fascinating Language. It was very hard to pick just one because obviously every language is fascinating in its own way, but I tried to highlight different issues, different either structural issues or sociolinguistic issues or historical issues about some particular language that's interesting in some particular way. Another feature that I added is another type of textbook. So there's even more sort of breakdown into little bits of text that I think are more manageable to today's students who can't just like read 500 pages of text, just straight linear text. So I think that makes it a much better tool for online learning. There's whole new sections in the book. I've finally written a section on sign languages that was never part of the book before, but now there's a substantial section that was in sort of collaboration. It was commented on by a sign language expert. I wrote a section on constructed languages because students are often interested in things like Esperanto or Dothraki or Navi. So there's a section on constructed languages and how they're different from natural language. So I think that also helps us highlight sort of the wonders of human natural languages. There's some material between the different editions that's moved between different chapters. There's actually a lot of moving pieces. I'm not going to tell you now what they are, but people who've used earlier editions, you'll find that some stuff has moved from one chapter to another. Some stuff has disappeared from a later edition, but a lot of stuff has been added. So there's each subsequent edition has more material than the previous one. So that's a very brief introduction to Introduction, Languages of the World and Introduction. This is again the second edition that's available currently, and the third edition is coming up this fall and can be pre-ordered already, both Amazon and Cambridge University Press. Let me tell you a little bit about my teaching experience in teaching languages of the world remotely online. So that was 2015, I believe, about 5 years ago, that I taught it to people from all over the world. I had about 25 students in the class. The class was originally set to be online, and so it went for 10 weeks, and for each week, I had a pre-recorded lecture, and it was very short, about 6 to 8 minute lecture. And I think my first tip, if you now have sort of the breather over the summer to think about how to do the courses, my first and biggest tip is to not try to emulate a real life class, an offline class online. Just don't try to do the same thing online. Kind of rethink the whole thing, how it can be done best online. And I think making a lot of different short things and making a lot of them asynchronous is very helpful. I've been teaching online quite a bit, and my students are from all over the world, and some of them have 17 hours time difference with me. So I've learned not to rely on synchronous, 2-hour Zoom lecture, because that is just not what's going to serve the best interests of a lot of your students. Also, people have very different capabilities in terms of stable internet, cameras, equipment, all of that stuff. So just don't rely on, we'll do the exact same thing on Zoom. So that's my biggest tip. Break it down into small things, like a short video that's pre-recorded, maybe a shorter synchronous lecture through Zoom, but not a full-length lecture as you would normally do in a classroom. PowerPoint slides that are available for them to look at. And I've learned over sort of like trial and error, because I've taught multiple courses online, years ago, is to add a lot more written material. So you really have to spell everything out, because students won't necessarily have the same level of narration that you normally do when you're just in a live class, in a classroom class. So just do different little things and try to find a way to sort of juggle a lot of multiple elements in the class. And my kind of last big tip is think about how you're going to create a community, because often people can't be on a camera, or don't have internet that's enough internet to be on camera, so you don't necessarily see people. Like, I don't see you guys now, I'm just talking to myself on the screen. So we don't, with online teaching, we don't get the same level of feedback. We don't see the students in the same way that we see them in a real classroom. We don't see if they're interested, if they're following, if they understand what's going on. So thinking kind of in advance of how you're going to establish kind of a community of learning, really, as opposed to just a lot of the things that I've seen online is just basically somebody kind of broadcasting. It's almost the same as turning on a TV. There's very little interactive kind of capability. I mean, Zoom was not really originally designed for teaching. It was more for business meetings. So it doesn't work perfectly for what we need it to work for. So kind of think about how you're going to do this. And one of the things that worked best when I taught on Zoom for like sort of pre-planned online classes was to have discussion boards that were kind of Facebook format, if you will, a post, comments, comments on comments. And people really got into chatting with one another somewhat asynchronously, so nobody felt like they had to be there on the dot, look their best on camera, and have that interaction in a synchronous fashion necessarily. But the discussions were really very lively. So for every week, I set out kind of a discussion topic, and I'm very happy to share those with anyone who's interested for this particular class. But there was a discussion topic, like maybe a problem, or maybe something like go online and go to that resource and explore this, and then let's talk about it. So it wasn't just for people to opinionate on something, whatever they think about a topic. It had some kind of guided learning built into that discussion, but it was very, very helpful because people talked to one another, they learned from one another. I monitored it and I replied. I mean, it's a lot of work, obviously, but really to do online teaching effectively, it does take a lot more work than doing it in a classroom. There's no way of avoiding that. But that really created a community, and people engaged with the course a lot more, and people felt like it gave them something besides the knowledge of X, Y, Z, the topics that we covered. It also provided them with some kind of, social outlet and a true kind of a community of learning. So I think that's really important when everybody is just at home, isolated. I mean, in the last 4 months, whenever I taught a class, the students always tell me that it's just great that I have that 1 hour or 2 hours, whatever the length of the class is in a week, to not worry about the virus and whatnot, but to engage with other people on other topics and to learn and to broaden their horizons. So I think that's absolutely vital. Okay, I've been talking for about 18 minutes, so I'm now happy to start answering questions. I know we had some advanced questions, but I hope that's only just for us to start going, and people will write the questions that come up. And also, if you have tips, if you have advice, you've all had some experience teaching online, probably, in this kind of hectic format. So please feel free to share those, and I'll read them out as well. So we have the first question, an advanced question. For instructors without their own existing material, do you have any recommendations of an online content or resources that lecturers could make use of? I do. Well, first of all, let me, a little self-advertisement. I'll mention my website that I've been running for over 10 years called languagesoftheworld.info. Languages of the World, all one word, .info. There's a lot of information, some of it complementary to the book. So that's a good starting point. There's also a tab there, a page with helpful resources that I've been accumulating over the years, and also a discussion of helpful linguistic books that are written not as textbooks, but are written for a general reader, because particularly if you teach this as a kind of entry-level course, it's very useful to have other books, and there aren't very many, unfortunately, so you can look at those resources. They're also really good resources, videos on YouTube on different topics. There's, I'm trying to remember the name of that particular person. It'll come to me. I will mention it. There's a series of videos on introductory syntax. So that's particularly if you think about syntax of different languages, or just even kind of gentle introduction to syntax, by Caroline Haycock of the University of Edinburgh. Professionally done, really good, somewhat academic, but still very, very accessible videos. There's a Treff Tutor, I think. Let me open YouTube and I'll probably remember then. I'm very bad at remembering names, unfortunately, so I have to look things up in terms of just remembering the particular channels. There's Native Lang, which has on YouTube, native without the E at the end, Nativ Lang channel on YouTube. The Ling Space, that's 2 words, or 3 words rather, the Ling Space. They do great videos, and you can have playlists, so you can kind of look through, or they have over 100 videos, I think, by now. So there's Tom Scott, who does really good videos on YouTube. They're all done by young linguists who, or linguistics graduates at least, who could, do things in a very engaging way, and also kind of technologically more savvy than a lot of older people know how to do. So Tom Scott is very good. And there was Treff Tutor, I believe it's called, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, so those are the ones that I can kind of recommend off the top of my head, and I will keep adding the different resources to my website also as I find other things. So check in languagesoftheworld.info. Do we have more advanced questions, or people can think of good questions? Oh yeah. Do you have any advice for keeping students engaged? I think this is really a great question, because I think engagement is the thing that suffers because we don't have that physical presence effect. So that's really sort of the hardest problem in remote teaching. I think what works really well is to give students room to participate and to be sort of interactive in a variety of ways, whether it's to even just ask students specifically to put themselves on camera, to turn on the cameras when they are in a Zoom meeting, for example, or whatever platform you use, to use whatever chat resources. Like there's different platforms that people use, different universities use different platforms, but they usually have some kind of forum chat capability. I even ran Facebook groups that were private just for students in the class, so they're not open to just anyone walking off the street. But anything that allows for this kind of interactive format where people can chat with one another and chat with you, the instructor, I think that's super important, because broadcasting our knowledge, we have tools to do, but engagement is really the hardest nut. So this is a great question. So this is something I think that we need to think about really kind of specifically now that we're maybe on a summer break and have time to think about that. But that's an awesome question. A question from Nancy Kaplow. Great. So we now have online questions coming up. Did you have students to do research projects individually, in pairs, or in small groups as part of the course? Yes. As part of a regular offline course, I often give them research projects. If so, what kinds of projects work for students with little linguistics background? For offline class, I often did projects about a certain language or a group of languages. So I would have like a hat with, pieces of paper, and students like pull a random piece of paper with some random language that they then have to prepare a little presentation about. And that gives them something, I don't like just sending them online, I go research online, but it was very kind of guided online research project. And I think this can be accommodated for remote learning as well. So that worked very well. Like, here's a language for you, go find out where it's spoken, by how many people, what is the status of this language, is it endangered? Endangerment is a big part of the course, of course. So what are some of the interesting phonetic features, syntactic features, blah, blah, blah. Even for people who don't have a lot of background, by the middle of the class, they know enough to look at the IPA chart for the language if one is available, right? And say, okay, well, this language has, these interesting sounds. English doesn't have that. So even if you sort of ask them to do things, but kind of very, very specific questions, I think that works the best if you really kind of guide them what to go and look for and what to explore. Another type of project that I did was to do problem sets, and there's examples of both types of projects in the book. Each chapter has, if you open the part where it's the problems, do it yourself, it's called. The first problem or set of problems is called Explore the Web, and it's really suggestions for guided learning, like explore walls or foiable, look at this particular feature, which languages have that, how is it spread, read this thing online, sort of look up certain things, how you might explain this. So there's some very specific questions to answer, but they can go online and explore it on their own. So I think that really accommodates well the whole remote format. There's some questions for kind of a broader open discussion, so those can be accommodated for this kind of a forum chat format. And then there are problem sets called Analyze Linguistic Data. So here's a little piece of data from Hindi or from Ukrainian or from whichever language that might be, and they have to answer specific questions based on just the data that they have there. So they don't have to go and find some other resources to solve the very specific, like we do those little problem sets. I'm sure you're familiar with that format. So all of these different things can be used as a homework, as a sort of a project. I've never been successful in doing group projects or paired projects online. So it was individual projects online. I did group projects in a group, in a regular sort of live setting. Primarily because I had people who didn't really know one another. If you teach a cohort of students who've already met one another and they're kind of more uniform in their knowledge and a kind of a more regular classroom, online that might work. I taught online for, just people from all walks of life, so to speak, adult education. So it was kind of hard to figure out how to pair them, but that is another possibility. Great question. Another question from Marjorie Park. Some of what students need to gain in a Languages of the World class is simple fact-based knowledge, identifying language families, classifications, geography, etc. How do you assess this kind of knowledge in an online class? That's a great question. And in working on the book, which was of course never meant to be just for online learning, remote learning. I mean, even when the proofs went to print, it was still before the lockdown started for the new edition. What I've been thinking about in working on the book and working on kind of making it a really useful textbook is supplementing what's available online, because a lot of this information is online. So people keep asking me, like, why do we need a textbook if you can go and Google or go to Wikipedia and find all this information? I think the most important thing that we need to do in the class is to teach them to process that information, right? And to give them some kind of like an assessment, right? I mean, that's what we as instructors are there for. We have to be complementary to what's, on Wikipedia, because obviously they can find that information in 2 clicks, right? So in terms of assessing that knowledge, I figured that part of what I wanted them to do was really to kind of get, not just to memorize like a lot of facts, because really you can always check online. Like if, somebody asked me, one of those 800 languages, I don't necessarily remember where each language is spoken or what family it belongs to and that sort of thing, but I know where to find it online. So teaching them good use of good resources is one thing, and those kinds of projects like go find out about this language or this family of languages was a very good way of both learning and assessing their knowledge. But I also did multiple choice exams for things like, which of these language families are spoken in Africa, boom, 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 choices, like mark all that apply, right? Or which languages typically have ejective sound, all the options, mark all that apply. And those were exams, for students in a live environment, offline environment. But there are ways that, depending on which platform your school uses, there are ways to do online exams where they can't really, cheat or use resources. But I find that it's more important to really teach them kind of a bigger overview, or asking questions, or like processing that information, rather than just memorizing stuff, because they can always look it up. So I think that's really important. After this question, we have room for one more question, but if you have other questions or tips or advice, please keep them coming, and we'll try to address them all after the recording ends, because those are all great questions. We have another question, advanced question, I believe. Do you think the current situation will change how courses are taught and encourage instructors to experiment with how they teach in the future? Well, I think that's absolutely the case. I think we are past, this is just going to be for a couple of weeks or maybe till the end of term, and we'll just go back to the way things were. I think that there's going to be a lot more online instruction involved, even when the pandemic subsides, which I hope it will soon, for all of our benefit. I think that offline instruction has its own benefits. And I think kind of going to online only is going to be the greatest mistake ever. But it's certainly going to change how we teach. And I think thinking about the way that students are much more online these days, that there are online resources, that there are maps. Another new feature of the 3rd edition vis-a-vis the 1st and the 2nd is I included a section on cartography and language maps, and how to tell a good map from a bad map, and some examples, and with specific references to things that are available online. So I think it's important as instructors that we think about how we can teach, not just because we're now stuck teaching in Zoom or whatever, but how can we teach students when so much information is easily available online? How do we complement that, and how do we teach them kind of an umbrella view, not just like learning little facts, because little facts is things they can easily look up on their smartphones now. We can think of better uses for our brain capacities, I think, as instructors. That's really important. I have time for one more question, absolutely. Question from Leslie Lane. I work through lots of morphology exercises on the whiteboard with students, and I'm trying to think about how to do that in an online format. Do you know of any apps or methods that work well, like the Analyze Linguistic Data sections from the book? Great question. I really struggled with it because I missed whiteboard, or Blackboard or any board. I love visuals. And languages of the world, there's a lot of stuff that we do, problem solving, and there's also a lot of visuals that we use, like maps and different diagrams and things like that. So very important. Zoom allows you to share screens so you can show the visuals. I find it easier to type, like share my PowerPoint screen and type in it, rather than use a whiteboard. Zoom also has a whiteboard, but you have to kind of handwrite on it. And my handwriting with a mouse, doing graphics with the mouse is just absolutely horrible. So I can't really use that effectively. It just looks like a first grader or kindergarten kid writing. So I can't really use whiteboards as such. I purchased a tiny whiteboard that's about that big, just like a regular whiteboard with markers. And when I taught phonology and morphology class this spring, and I taught a syntax class, and of course there's trees and there's morphological trees and there are all kinds of things like that. I would just write on the whiteboard, turn it around to me, and then just turn it to students, and was very easy to point at things, erase something, write something, and that kind of faked the real classroom teaching. And I think students kind of like that in a transition because I started the classes, I taught half of the class in a classroom, and then we had to transition kind of very quickly to online teaching. So I think they like that in the transition, but I think in long term, I would rather have things on a shared screen, or even just sort of type things in PowerPoint, and use that as a kind of a fake whiteboard. There are other whiteboards. There's the Miro board, which allows everyone to write on it kind of simultaneously. Miro, M-I-R-O. It's like a whiteboard, but it kind of incorporates PowerPoint in it. You can have a presentation and also have people write on it kind of all at the same time. It sort of reminds me of those like big boards that police officers, detectives have in crime TV shows, when they write on the board and show things on the board, and everybody can kind of share at the same time. So there are other tools. If other people can think of other tools, please feel free to share your tips. This is what I've used in my teaching. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and watching afterwards, if you watch the recording later. Again, this was a little discussion of how we transition with teaching introductory linguistic courses, particularly languages of the world, or some kind of introductory linguistic course as such, and also the textbook that I've written and used for my class, Languages of the World, in Introduction. This is the second edition of it, and the third edition is coming out in the fall, available for winter, spring semester. You can start pre-ordering it and get your exam copies if you're interested for the third edition. Third edition has even more materials that are adaptable to online formats, so really can't recommend it enough. So thank you very much, everyone, and I wish everyone the best of luck. If you have any comments, tips, questions, suggestions, I'm happy to address them later in the written form. And I wish you all the best in your teaching. And we're all learning as we teach online. And, we have to look forward as kind of a growing experience to us as teachers, right? We have a little curveball thrown at us, but we'll all manage. Thank you very much, and goodbye.